trapped in grain. On July 28, 2010, a 14-year-old boy named Wyatt Whitebread climbed into a grain bin at the Haasbach LLC grain storage facility in Mount Carroll, Illinois, to help break up crusted corn, blocking the drain. He did not come out alive. A 19-year-old coworker named Alex Pacas also died in the same bin that day. A third worker, Will Piper, age 20, survived after a rescue lasting more than 6 hours. Grain bins are a fixture of agricultural life across the American Midwest. They rise above the flat landscape in clusters. Tall cylindrical structures made of corrugated steel filled each harvest season with corn, soybeans, or wheat. From the outside, they look inert, passive. They are not. Inside, grain behaves according to its own rules that do not accommodate mistakes. The Haasbach facility in Mount Carroll held corn, and like many bins that season, the corn had crusted over near the top, forming a hardened surface layer that concealed loose flowing grain beneath. Crusted grain is a common problem. When airflow through a bin is uneven, moisture causes the grain to bind together on top while the grain below continues to shift and settle. Workers enter bins to break up these crusted sections so the grain can flow properly through the auger at the bottom. It is considered routine maintenance. Whitebread, Paces, and Piper entered the bin to do exactly that. The work was the kind of task that had been done at that facility and on farms across Illinois hundreds of times before. There was no reason on that morning to expect anything other than an ordinary day. The corn gave way without warning. Crusted grain collapses inward, and the grain beneath behaves like water. It flows toward the lowest point, which, once a person breaks through the crust, becomes the space around their body. OSHA documents confirm that a person can be engulfed up to their waist in as little as 4 seconds after breaking through a crusted surface. Full engulfment can follow within seconds more, depending on grain depth and flow rate. When the facility supervisor opened a second drain hole in the bottom of the bin, a second cone of flowing grain formed. Whitebread was caught first. He went down fast. Pacas and Piper went in after him and were also pulled in. The grain rose around them as it flowed. It filled the space at their sides, then climbed their torsos. Grain exerts lateral pressure that compounds with depth. At waist depth, the pressure on the human body from surrounding grain is sufficient to make self-extraction impossible. The grain does not feel like sand at a beach. It compresses. It locks. Every attempt to move upward causes the grain at the sides to shift further inward, increasing the pressure. Rescue organizations that train for grain entrapment describe the force required to extract a person buried to the waist as equivalent to lifting a small vehicle. Emergency services were contacted. The rescue and recovery effort at the bin spanned more than 13 hours, involving over 200 people. Grain rescue operations require specialized equipment and trained personnel. The primary tool is a grain rescue tube, a large metal cylinder with a sharpened or open bottom that is driven into the grain around the victim. Workers insert panels or sections of the tube into the grain, building a protective wall around the person while scooping grain from inside the tube. This creates a pocket around the victim and reduces the lateral pressure enough to allow extraction. The process is not fast. Each section of the rescue tube must be driven carefully. Grain inside the tube must be removed by hand or with small tools because power augers near a victim create their own lethal risk. Rescuers work in the grain themselves, in a confined space in conditions where additional crusting or shifting can endanger them as well. Wyatt Whitebread and Alex Pacas were pulled from the grain bin after 10 p.m. and were pronounced dead. Will Piper survived after rescuers worked to reach him, using grain rescue tubes and vacuum equipment to remove corn around him. He was extracted through a hole cut in the side of the bin and flown by helicopter to a hospital. The confirmed cause of the deaths was suffocation. Grain entrapment compresses the chest, restricts the ability to draw breath, and when the grain reaches the level of the chest and neck, suffocation follows. Following the incident, OSHA cited the facility operator with serious safety violations and levied one of its largest fines on record for a grain entrapment case. The OSHA standard governing grain handling, 29 CFR 1910.272, prohibits workers from entering grain storage structures while grain removal equipment is operating and requires specific safety measures, including lockout procedures and observer presence. None of the 3 workers sent into the bin had been trained in proper safety procedures, and Wyatt Whitebread, at 14, was too young to legally work inside a grain bin. The standard existed before Whitebread and Pacas entered that bin. It was not followed. Boiled from inside. On October 11, 2012, Jose Melena, a 62-year-old maintenance worker at the Bumblebee Foods tuna processing plant in Santa Fe Springs, California, was placed inside an industrial retort oven and cooked to death when a coworker, unaware he was inside, sealed the door and began a pressure cooking cycle. The Bumblebee Foods facility in Santa Fe Springs was a large commercial cannery. Retort ovens, also called pressure cookers or autoclaves in industrial contexts, are core equipment in canned food production. They They are large metal chambers, big enough to hold entire racks of canned product, and they operate at temperatures and pressures far beyond anything in a domestic kitchen. The purpose of a retort cycle is sterilization. Canned tuna goes in, the door is sealed, and the chamber is brought to temperatures sufficient to destroy bacteria and extend shelf life. A standard retort cycle runs at roughly 270 degrees Fahrenheit under significant pressure. Nothing inside survives it. On that Thursday in October, Molina was performing maintenance inside one of the facility's retort ovens. He had entered the chamber to conduct work. What happened next was documented through a subsequent investigation by the California Division of Occupational Safety and Health, known as Cal/OSHA, and through criminal proceedings that followed. A coworker preparing to run a production cycle did not know Molina was inside the retort. The chamber held approximately 12,000 pounds of canned tuna in addition to Molina. The door was sealed. The cycle began. The retort ran its full program duration. When workers opened the chamber afterward, they found Molina's remains. Cal/OSHA investigated the incident in detail. The investigation determined that the facility lacked adequate lockout procedures for the retort ovens. Lockout/tagout protocols, required under federal and state occupational safety standards, are designed specifically to prevent equipment from being activated while workers are inside or in contact with it. A worker entering a confined space or piece of equipment is supposed to apply a physical lock to the control point, making it impossible for anyone else to start the equipment until the lock is removed by the person who placed it. No such control prevented the retort from being started with Molina inside. Bumblebee Foods was cited by Cal/OSHA. The company was also charged criminally. In 2015, Bumblebee Foods reached a settlement involving a $6 million total payout, which prosecutors described as the largest criminal settlement in California for a workplace safety violation involving a single victim. The plant safety manager directly responsible pleaded guilty to a felony violation of California labor law. The plant's director of operations faced a separate resolution. Jose Molina died inside the retort oven. The cause of death was the result of exposure to the extreme heat and pressure of a full industrial cooking cycle. He was 62 years old. Molasses City flood. On January 15, 1919, a storage tank containing 2,300,000 gallons of molasses collapsed in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, sending a wave of liquid through the streets that killed 21 people and injured 150 more. The North End of Boston in 1919 was a dense, working-class neighborhood. Narrow streets, brick buildings sitting close together, a waterfront not far away. The area around Commercial Street, where the tank stood, was active with commerce and foot traffic. Workers moved through the yards of the Purity Distilling Company, part of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company operation. Nearby, a firehouse sat close enough that its personnel would be among the first to respond to what was about to happen. The tank itself was enormous, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter. It had been built in 1915 to hold molasses used in the production of industrial alcohol, including rum and munitions. Related products during the recently concluded war. Residents of the North End had noticed problems with the tank for years. Molasses seeped through the seams. The tank groaned. Children in the neighborhood were known to collect spilled molasses from the ground around its base. The company had received complaints and had painted the tank brown, reportedly to make the leaks less visible. On January 15th, the temperature in Boston had climbed unusually fast after a cold stretch. Molasses expands as it warms, and the tank had been freshly filled following a delivery the day before. At approximately 12:40 p.m., the tank failed. The noise was described by witnesses as a roar and as a sound like a rapid sequence of loud pops, consistent with rivet failures propagating around the tank's seams. The tank did not simply crack. It came apart. 2,300,000 gallons of molasses released in seconds. The wave that rolled out from the tank has been estimated at 25 feet high at its crest and moving at 35 miles per hour at the point of initial release. At that speed, there was no outrunning it. The molasses struck the supports of an elevated railway structure and damaged them. It demolished a section of the firehouse. It swept workers off their feet across the Purity Distilling Yard. It carried debris, horses, lumber, and people through the streets of the North End. Molasses does not behave like water as it spreads. It slows as it cools. What arrived as a fast-moving wave became, within minutes, a viscous, thickening mass that trapped everything it had knocked down. People caught in it could not move. The weight of the molasses on the chest restricted breathing. The cold January air accelerated the thickening. Boston police, firefighters, the Red Cross, and United States Navy personnel from the nearby naval yard all responded. Rescuers waded into the molasses to reach victims. The substance clung to everything. Workers and rescuers alike were coated in it. Reaching a person trapped under the cooling molasses and extracting them without further injuring them was difficult work done in difficult conditions. 21 people were confirmed dead, victims. included workers from the distilling yard and nearby businesses, bystanders on Commercial Street, and a young girl. 150 people were injured. The cleanup of the north end took weeks. Sailors with hoses used salt water from the harbor. The molasses spread into the harbor itself, turning the water brown. Residents reported the smell of molasses on warm days in the neighborhood for years afterward. A lawsuit brought against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company lasted 6 years. The plaintiffs ultimately prevailed. The case established documented evidence that the company had known of the tank's structural deficiencies and had prioritized production over repair. 21 people were pronounced dead. The cause was drowning, crushing injury, and suffocation within the molasses flow. The disaster remains one of the strangest and most documented industrial accidents in American history. Sugar refinery explosion. On February 7, 2008, at approximately 7:15 p.m., explosions tore through the Imperial Sugar Refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia, killing 14 workers and injuring 36 more. The Imperial Sugar Refinery was one of the largest sugar processing facilities in the United States. It sat in Port Wentworth, just outside Savannah, and it had operated for decades as a central part of the regional economy. The plant produced refined granulated sugar on an industrial scale. On the evening of February 7th, a full shift was working across the facility's various processing areas, including the packaging building, the refinery structure, and the interconnected conveyor systems that move sugar from processing to packaging. Sugar dust is combustible. This is a known and documented industrial hazard. When fine particles of sugar or any organic material become suspended in the air in sufficient concentration, they can ignite. A single spark is enough, and a dust explosion in one area can send a pressure wave through connected spaces, disturbing accumulated dust and triggering secondary explosions in rapid succession. The Chemical Safety Board, which investigated this incident thoroughly and released a full public report, confirmed this is precisely what happened at Imperial Sugar. Dust had accumulated in the packaging building and along the conveyor systems beneath the silos. The accumulations were, according to the CSB report, significant. Equipment in the packaging building became a point of ignition. The initial explosion sent a pressure wave outward through the structure. The secondary explosions followed. Workers in the packaging building were in the direct path of the initial blast and the fires that followed. The conveyor tunnels beneath the silos, where sugar dust had collected in quantity, became channels for the explosive force. Workers in those areas had almost no warning. 36 workers were injured, 14 were killed, 8 workers died at the scene, and 6 more succumbed to their injuries in the days and weeks that followed. Some workers sustained severe burn injuries and were transported to regional burn centers, some as far as Augusta and beyond. The Chemical Safety Board investigation produced one of the most detailed analyses of a combustible dust explosion in American regulatory history. The CSB found that sugar dust had been allowed to accumulate throughout the facility, that the dust collection systems were inadequate, and that the company lacked a comprehensive program for managing combustible dust hazards. The CSB used the Imperial Sugar disaster as a central case in its push for a federal standard specifically addressing combustible dust in industrial facilities. OSHA cited the company. The CSB issued formal recommendations to OSHA to promulgate a combustible dust standard. Congressional attention followed. 14 workers were confirmed dead. The cause was blast injury and severe burns sustained during the explosion and fire sequence at the Imperial Sugar Refinery on February 7, 2008. Peanut butter fraud. Between 2008 and 2009, the Peanut Corporation of America deliberately shipped peanut products it knew to be contaminated with salmonella, killing 9 people and sickening more than 700 across 46 states. The Peanut Corporation of America, known as PCA, operated a processing plant in Blakely, Georgia. PCA was not a consumer-facing brand. It was a supplier, a company that sold processed peanut products in bulk to other manufacturers who used them as ingredients. Its customers included companies that made crackers, cookies, ice cream, and institutional food products. Its products reached school lunch programs. They reached nursing homes. They moved through the supply chain quietly, inside other brands' packaging, arriving on the trays of people who had no way of knowing the peanut paste in their food had come from a plant in Blakely, Georgia. FDA inspections of the Blakely facility, conducted after the outbreak was identified, documented conditions that confirmed what internal company records would later make explicit. The roof leaked. Water dripped into production areas. Inspectors found evidence of rodent activity. The facility's sanitation practices were inadequate by any measurable standard. PCA conducted its own internal testing. When tests came back positive for salmonella, the company did not stop production. Company records obtained during the subsequent federal investigation showed that PCA shipped products that had tested positive, in some cases seeking retests from different labs in search of a negative result, and in some cases shipping before any confirmation was received. The CDC and FDA identified the outbreak in late 2008. The traceback investigation pointed to PCA's Blakely plant. The contaminating organism was Salmonella typhimurium. It was isolated from victims and matched to samples taken from the facility itself. 700 people were confirmed ill across 46 states. 9 people died. The outbreak disproportionately affected the elderly and the immunocompromised, the populations most likely to encounter PCA's products in institutional food service settings. Nursing home residents were among those who died. More than 3,900 separate products were recalled. The recall cascaded through the food supply for weeks as manufacturers identified every product that had used PCA ingredients and pulled it from shelves. Stuart Parnell, the chief executive officer of the Peanut Corporation of America, was indicted on federal charges. Prosecutors presented internal communications showing Parnell's direct involvement in decisions to ship contaminated product. In 2014, Parnell was convicted on 71 federal counts, including conspiracy, fraud, and the introduction of adulterated food into interstate commerce. He was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. At the time of sentencing, it was the longest prison sentence ever imposed in a United States food safety case. 9 people were confirmed dead. The cause was Salmonella typhimurium. The source was the Peanut Corporation of America's plant in Blakely, Georgia. Flour mill Inferno. On May 2, 1878, the Washburn Mill in Minneapolis, Minnesota, exploded without warning, killing 18 workers and destroying 6 mills in one of the deadliest industrial disasters in the history of American food production. In 1878, Minneapolis was flour. The city sat at the falls of St. Anthony on the Mississippi River, and the water power those falls generated had turned Minneapolis into the milling center of the nation. The Washburn Mill was the crown of that industry. It was the largest flour mill in the United States at the time, a massive stone structure on the riverbank that ground wheat from the northern plains into the fine white flour that fed the expanding American market. The mill ran through the night. Workers on the evening shift maintained the grinding stones, monitored the flow of grain and flour through the mill's internal systems, and kept the enormous operation moving. It was skilled industrial work, requiring knowledge of the machinery and attention to the constant flow of material through the building. What those workers did not have adequate protection against was the air itself. Flour dust, like sugar dust and grain dust, is combustible when suspended in sufficient concentration. The interior of an active flour mill in 1878 was a cloud of fine particulate. Every surface was coated. Every breath brought it in. The grinding stones themselves created friction. The combination of suspended combustible dust and an ignition source, whether a spark from the millstones or another mechanism, created the conditions for what followed. At approximately 7 p.m. on May 2nd, the Washburn A exploded. The force of the explosion was heard miles away. Contemporaneous newspaper accounts from Minneapolis described the sound as felt as much as heard. The mill did not suffer a partial collapse. The explosion essentially destroyed it, and the force propagated outward through the connected infrastructure of the milling district. 5 neighboring mills were also destroyed. 6 mills in total were gone by the time the destruction was complete. Approximately 1/3 of Minneapolis's total milling capacity was eliminated in a matter of seconds. 18 workers inside the Washburn A were killed. The nature of the explosion meant that most deaths were immediate. Rescue and recovery operations worked through the rubble of the collapsed stone structure in the days that followed. The loss was industrial as well as human. The Washburn A had been the most productive flour mill in the country. Its destruction was felt commercially across the region and nationally in flour markets. Cadwallader Washburn, who owned the mill, rebuilt. The new Washburn A, completed within 2 years, incorporated safety innovations directly informed by what had destroyed its predecessor. New dust collection systems were installed. Ventilation was redesigned. The disaster accelerated development of milling safety practices that would become standard across the industry. 18 workers were confirmed dead on May 2nd, 1878. The cause was a flour dust explosion inside the Washburn Mill in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Liquid nitrogen cocktail. On October 4th, 2012, an 18-year-old named Gabby Scanlon drank a cocktail prepared with liquid nitrogen at a bar in Lancaster, England, and within minutes required emergency surgery that resulted in the complete removal of her stomach. Scanlon was celebrating her 18th birthday at Oscar's Wine Bar in Lancaster that evening. She was with friends. The occasion was ordinary, the kind of birthday celebration that happens in bars and restaurants across England on any given Friday night. Oscar's Wine Bar had been offering a drink called Nitro Jägermeister. The drink was prepared with liquid nitrogen, which produces a dramatic visual effect when combined with liquid at room temperature. The nitrogen vaporizes rapidly, producing a dense cloud that billows from the glass. It was the kind of presentation that attracted attention and photographs. It was being served as a novelty drink. Liquid nitrogen is stored at negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit. When it contacts a warmer liquid, it vaporizes almost instantly. When it vaporizes inside an enclosed space, including a human stomach, it expands in volume by a factor of approximately 700. The physics of what happens when liquid nitrogen reaches the stomach before it is fully vaporized are not ambiguous. Scanlon drank the cocktail. She complained of stomach pain almost immediately. The pain was severe enough that emergency services were contacted. She was transported to Lancaster Royal Infirmary. Surgeons at Lancaster Royal Infirmary assessed the damage the liquid nitrogen had caused to her stomach. The injury was not treatable through repair. The decision was made to perform a gastrectomy, the surgical removal of the stomach. The procedure was confirmed in subsequent court records and was reported in detail by contemporaneous news coverage. Scanlon's stomach was removed. She survived. The surgery was successful in the sense that she lived, but the consequences were permanent. Life without a stomach requires fundamental changes to how a person eats and how their body processes nutrition. Scanlon's injury was irreversible. The bar was prosecuted. In 2015, Chong Wang-chan, the owner of Oscar's Wine Bar, was convicted of food safety offenses. He was fined. The conviction was confirmed through court records. The United Kingdom's Food Standards Agency issued guidance following the incident, warning about the risks of serving liquid nitrogen to consumers in food and drink applications before it had fully dissipated. Gabby Scanlon survived. Her stomach was permanently removed. The confirmed cause of the injury was liquid nitrogen ingested before it had vaporized, causing catastrophic damage to the stomach wall. Chong Wang-chan was convicted and fined in 2015. Jack in the Box. Between November of 1992 and February of 1993, an E. coli outbreak linked to undercooked ground beef served at Jack in the Box restaurants killed 4 children and left hundreds of others with injuries some would carry for the rest of their lives. Jack in the Box was a major fast food chain in the western United States in the early 1990s. It operated hundreds of locations across Washington State, California, Idaho, and Nevada, among other states. The chain served millions of customers each year. Ground beef was a central ingredient. It arrived from suppliers, was stored, cooked on flat-top grills, and served inside hamburgers to customers of every age. The beef at the center of the outbreak came primarily from a supplier. The organism responsible was E. coli O157:H7, a strain that produces toxins capable of causing severe intestinal illness, and in the most serious cases, a condition called hemolytic uremic syndrome, which causes kidney failure. Children and the elderly are at the greatest risk of developing the most severe complications. E. coli O157:H7 is killed by adequate heat. The failure in this case was a failure of temperature. Washington state's required minimum cooking temperature for ground beef at the time was 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The federal standard was 155 degrees. Jack in the Box's own internal policies had been updated to reflect the higher federal standard, but the updated cooking procedures had not been effectively communicated or implemented across the chain's restaurant locations. The beef was being cooked to a temperature that left the pathogen viable. Customers began falling ill in November of 1992. By January of 1993, the pattern was unmistakable to public health investigators. Children across Washington state were being hospitalized with severe intestinal illness and kidney failure. The CDC and state health departments traced the outbreak to Jack in the Box. The chain issued a recall of its beef and suspended use of the implicated product on January 18th, 1993. The outbreak ultimately confirmed more than 700 cases across 4 states. 178 people were hospitalized. Dozens suffered permanent kidney damage from hemolytic uremic syndrome. 4 children died. The youngest victims were particularly vulnerable. The toxin produced by E. coli O157:H7 attacks the lining of blood vessels and can trigger complete kidney failure in children with no prior health conditions. Medical teams at Seattle area hospitals worked to treat children whose kidney function had collapsed. For 4 of them, treatment could not reverse what the pathogen had already done. The outbreak changed American food safety in measurable ways. The federal minimum cooking temperature for ground beef was raised to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The USDA's application of hazard analysis and critical control points, known as HACCP, to meat processing was significantly expanded and accelerated. E. coli O157:H7 was declared an adulterant in ground beef, meaning its presence in any detectable quantity rendered the product illegal to sell. 4 children were confirmed dead. The cause was complications from E. coli O157:H7 infection, contracted through undercooked ground beef served at Jack in the Box restaurants in the winter of 1992 and 1993. Radium Girls Kitchen. Beginning in the 1910s and continuing through the 1920s, young women employed at the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, were instructed to place their radium-laced paintbrushes between their lips to maintain a fine point. They did it thousands of times. They ingested radium with every stroke. It killed them slowly from the inside out. Radium was a wonder of the early 20th century. Discovered by Marie Curie, it glowed in the dark with a pale greenish light, and that property made it extraordinarily commercially valuable in the years before its biological effects were fully understood. Watch manufacturers needed dials that soldiers and officers could read in the dark. The United States Radium Corporation, operating in Orange, New Jersey, had a solution. It employed young women, many of them teenagers and women in their early 20s, to paint the numerals and hands of watch dials with a luminous radium-based paint called Undark. The work was precise work. The brushes had to maintain a very fine point to produce clean numerals on small dial faces. The technique the factory supervisors taught the women for maintaining that point was to bring the brush to their lips and shape it with their mouth. Lip point, dip in paint, apply to dial. Lip point, dip, apply over and over hundreds of times a day, thousands of times across a career. The paint tasted slightly sweet. The women were told it was harmless. Some of them, delighted by the way the paint glowed, used it to paint their nails, their faces, their teeth, joking that they glowed like ghosts in the dark on their walk home. Photographs from that era, taken with slow exposures in darkened rooms, show the painters themselves faintly luminous. The United States Radium Corporation was not ignorant of radium's dangers. Scientific literature on radium's biological effects existed. The company's own chemists and executives took precautions for themselves when handling the material. The women on the production floor were given none. The first signs of illness appeared as dental problems. Teeth became loose. Jawbones began to deteriorate. The condition was documented in clinical settings as necrosis of the jaw, and it was unlike ordinary infection or decay. The bone itself was dying. In some women, sections of the jaw simply crumbled. The damage spread. Radium, once ingested, behaves chemically like calcium and is incorporated into bone. There it irradiates surrounding tissue continuously, from within, for as long as the person lives. Women began dying. Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and others whose names appear in court records and contemporaneous journalism developed cancers, anemia, and bone destruction. They sought answers. Company physicians, in some cases hired by the United States Radium Corporation itself, provided reassurances or false diagnoses, attributing the women's illnesses to other causes. Grace Fryer attempted to sue the company. Finding a lawyer willing to take the case against a well-financed corporation took years. By the time the case moved toward trial, several of the plaintiffs were too ill to attend hearings in person. In 1928, the women reached a settlement. Each surviving plaintiff received $10,000, a sum equivalent to roughly $170,000 in contemporary terms, along with coverage of medical expenses and a continuing annuity. The settlement was reached in court in a proceeding that drew significant public attention. The women's conditions were documented in medical testimony that entered the public record. Several of the women who settled in 1928 did not live long afterward. The radium, already in their bones, continued its work. Multiple women confirmed to have worked as dial painters at the United States Radium Corporation died as a result of radiation-induced cancers, anemia, and bone necrosis caused by the ingestion of radium through the lip-pointing practice mandated by their supervisors. The cases of the Radium Girls became foundational to the development of occupational safety law in the United States and to the understanding of internal radiation exposure as a cause of disease. Colorado cantaloupe outbreak. In the summer of 2011, cantaloupes grown and packed at Jensen Farms in Holly, Colorado, left the farm carrying Listeria monocytogenes. By the time the outbreak was contained, 33 people were dead. It was the deadliest foodborne illness outbreak in the United States in nearly a century. Jensen Farms operated in the Arkansas River Valley of southeastern Colorado, in a region that had produced Rocky Ford cantaloupes for generations. The Rocky Ford cantaloupe had a reputation. Growers in the region took pride pride in it. Jensen Farms was one of the producers contributing to that reputation, selling its cantaloupes to distributors who moved the fruit to grocery stores across 25 states. In the summer of 2011, Jensen Farms introduced a new packing line. The line had been purchased secondhand and modified. It moved cantaloupes through a washing and drying process before they were packed for shipping. The design of the equipment created conditions that the FDA inspection, conducted after the outbreak was identified, described as problematic. The line was difficult to clean. It created areas where water pooled. Pooled water in food processing equipment is a growth environment for Listeria monocytogenes. Listeria monocytogenes is a bacterium with unusual characteristics. It grows at refrigerator temperatures, which most pathogens cannot. It survives on surfaces that have been wetted and dried repeatedly, and its incubation period in humans can range from 3 days to 70 days, meaning a person infected in late July might not become visibly ill until September. That long incubation window makes outbreak investigation difficult. By the time cases cluster visibly, the contaminated product may be long gone from store shelves. In late August and September of 2011, unusual numbers of Listeria cases began appearing across multiple states. The CDC traceback investigation required significant work because of the long incubation period and the wide distribution network the cantaloupes had passed through. The investigation pointed to Jensen Farms. Listeria monocytogenes isolated from patients was matched to samples taken from the Jensen Farms packing facility. Jensen Farms recalled all of its Rocky Ford cantaloupes on September 14, 2011. The recall came too late for 33 people. The victims were disproportionately elderly. The median age of those who died was 78. Listeria poses the greatest risk to elderly individuals, pregnant women, and the immunocompromised. Nursing home residents and hospital patients were among those who died. One miscarriage was also confirmed as linked to the outbreak. 147 people were confirmed ill across 28 states. Prior to the outbreak, Jensen Farms had been audited by a third-party food safety inspection company. The auditor had given the facility a rating of superior. That audit was conducted days before the recall. The gap between the auditor's assessment and the conditions the FDA found during its inspection drew sustained scrutiny from food safety advocates, regulators, and members of Congress. The role of third-party auditing in the food supply chain became a pointed subject of reform discussion in the years following the outbreak. Eric Jensen and Ryan Jensen, the brothers who owned and operated Jensen Farms, were charged federally. They pleaded guilty in 2013 to misdemeanor charges of introducing adulterated food into interstate commerce. They were sentenced to probation and home detention. Victims' families and food safety advocates publicly criticized the sentences as inadequate given the scale of the deaths. 33 people were confirmed dead. The cause was Listeria monocytogenes infection traced to cantaloupes from Jensen Farms in Holly, Colorado. Eric and Ryan Jensen pleaded guilty and were sentenced to probation and home detention. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.